Individualism is the moral stance, political philosophy, ideology, or social outlook that emphasizes the moral worth of the individual. Individualists promote the exercise of one's goals and desires and so value independence and self-reliance and advocate that interests of the individual should achieve precedence over the state or a social group, while opposing external interference upon one's own interests by society or institutions such as the government. Individualism is often defined in contrast to totalitarianism, collectivism and more corporate social forms. Individualism makes the individual its focus and so starts with the fundamental premise that the human individual is of primary importance in the struggle for liberation. Classical liberalism, existentialism, and anarchism are examples of movements that take the human individual as a central unit of analysis. Individualism thus involves the right of the individual to freedom and self-realization. It has also been used as a term denoting the quality of being an individual, individuality, related to possessing an individual characteristic, a quirk. Individualism is thus also associated with artistic and bohemian interests and lifestyles where there is a tendency towards self-creation and experimentation as opposed to traditional popular mass opinions and behaviors, as so also with humanist philosophical positions and ethics. Etymology. In the English language, the word individualism was first introduced as a pejorative by the Owenites in the late 1830s, although it is unclear if they were influenced by Cicermonianism or came up with it independently. A more positive use of the term in Britain came to be used with the writings of James Elisha Armour Smith, who was a millenarian and a Christian Israelite. Although an early Owenite socialist, he eventually rejected its collective idea of property, and found in individualism a universalism that allowed for the development of the original genius. Without individualism, Smith argued, individuals cannot amass property to increase one's happiness. William Mccool, another Unitarian preacher, and probably an acquaintance of Smith, came somewhat later, although influenced by John Stuart Mill, Thomas Carlyle, and German Romanticism, to the same positive conclusions in his 1847 work, Elements of Individualism. The individual. An individual is a person or any specific object in a collection. In the 15th century and earlier, and also today within the fields of statistics and metaphysics, individual means indivisible, typically describing any numerically singular thing, but sometimes meaning a person. For the 17th century on, individual indicates separateness, as in individualism. Individuality is the state or quality of being an individual, a person separate from other persons and possessing his or her own needs, goals, and desires. Individualism and society. Individualism holds that a person taking part in society attempts to learn and discover what his or her own interests are on a personal basis, without a presumed following of the interests of a societal structure. The individualist does not follow one particular philosophy, rather creates an amalgamation of elements of many, based on personal interests in particular aspects that he finds of use. On a societal level, the individualist participates on a personally structured political and moral ground. Independent thinking and opinion is a common trait of an individualist. Jean-Jacques Rousseau claims that his concept of general will in the social contract is not the simple collection of individual wills and that it furthers the interests of the individual. Societies and groups can differ in the extent extent to which they are based upon predominantly self-regarding, rather than other-regarding, behavior. Ruth Benedict made a distinction, relevant in this context, between guilt societies with an internal reference standard, and shame societies with an external reference standard, where people look to their peers for feedback on whether an action is acceptable or not. Individualism is often contrasted either with totalitarianism or with collectivism, but in fact there is a spectrum of behaviors at the societal level ranging from highly individualistic societies through mixed societies to collectivist. Individuation theories. The principle of individuation, or principium individuationis, describes the manner in which a thing is identified as distinguished from other things. For Carl Jung, individuation is a process of transformation, whereby the personal and collective unconscious is brought into consciousness to be assimilated into the whole personality. It is a completely natural process necessary for the integration of the psyche to take place. Jung considered individuation to be the central process of human development. In Individuation Psychique Collective, Gilbert Simondon developed a theory of individual and collective individuation in which the individual subject is considered as an effect of individuation rather than a cause. Thus, the individual atom is replaced by a never-ending ontological process of individuation. Individuation is an always incomplete process, always leaving a pre-individual left over, itself making possible future individuations. The philosophy of Bernard Stiegler draws upon and modifies the work of Gilbert Simondon on individuation and also upon similar ideas in Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud. For Stiegler, the "un" as a psychic individual can only be thought in relationship to we, which is a collective individual. The "I" is constituted in adopting a collective tradition, which it inherits and in which a plurality of I's acknowledge each other's existence. Methodological individualism. Methodological individualism is the view that phenomena can only be understood by examining how they result from the motivations and actions of individual agents. In economics, people's behavior is explained in terms of rational choices, as constrained by prices and incomes. The economist accepts individuals' preferences as givens. Becker and Stiegler provide a forceful statement of this view. On the traditional view, an explanation of economic phenomena that reaches a difference in tastes between people at times is the terminus of the argument. The problem is abandoned at this point to whoever studies and explains tastes. On our preferred interpretation, one never reaches this impasse. The economist continues to search for differences in prices or incomes to explain any differences or changes in behavior. Political individualism. Individualists are chiefly concerned with protecting individual autonomy against obligations imposed by social institutions. 4L. Susan Brown. Liberalism and anarchism are two political philosophies that are fundamentally concerned with individual freedom yet differ from one another in very distinct ways. Anarchism shares with liberalism a radical commitment to individual freedom while rejecting liberalism's competitive property relations. Civil libertarianism is a strain of political thought that supports civil liberties, or which emphasizes the supremacy of individual rights and personal freedoms over and against any kind of authority. Civil libertarianism is not complete ideology, rather, it is a collection of views on the specific issues of civil liberties and civil rights. Because of this, a civil libertarian outlook is compatible with many other political philosophies, and civil libertarianism is found on both the right and left in modern politics. For scholar and Mckeen's would. There are doctrines of individualism that are opposed to Lockean individualism. Non-Lockean individualism may encompass socialism, liberalism. Liberalism is the belief in the importance of individual freedom. This belief is widely accepted in the United States, Europe, Australia, and other Western nations, and was recognized as an important value by many Western philosophers throughout history, in particular since the Enlightenment. It is often rejected by collectivist, Islamic, or Confucian societies in Asia of the Middle East. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote praising the idea of a polity administered with regard to equal rights and equal freedom of speech, and the idea of a kingly government which respects most of all the freedom of the governed. Modern liberalism has its roots in the Age of Enlightenment and rejects many foundational assumptions that dominated most earlier theories of government, such as the divine right of kings, hereditary status, and established religion. John Locke is often credited with the philosophical foundations of classical liberalism. He wrote, "No one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." In the 17th century, liberal ideas began to influence governments in Europe, in nations such as the Netherlands, Switzerland, England, and Poland, but they were strongly opposed, often by armed might, by those who favored absolute monarchy and established religion. In the 18th century, in America, the first modern liberal state was founded without a monarch or a hereditary aristocracy. The American Declaration of Independence includes the words, "All men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving the just powers from the consent of the governed." Liberalism comes in many forms. According to John N. Gray, the essence of liberalism is toleration of different beliefs and of different ideas as to what constitutes a good life. Anarchism is a set of political philosophies that hold the state to be undesirable, unnecessary, or harmful, and often advocate stateless societies. While anti-statism is central, some argue that anarchism entails opposing authority, a hierarchical organization in the conduct of human relations, including, but not limited to, the state system. For influential Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta, all anarchists, whatever tendency they belong to, are individualists in some way or other, but the opposite is not true, not by any means. The individualists are thus divided into two distinct categories: one which claims the right to full development for all human individuality, their own and that of others; the other which only thinks about its own individuality and has absolutely no hesitation in sacrificing the individuality of others. The Tsar of all the Russias belongs to the latter category of individualists. We belong to the former. Individualist anarchism. Individualist anarchism refers to several traditions of thought within the anarchist movement that emphasize the individual, and the will over any kinds of external determinants such as groups, society, traditions, and ideological systems. Individualist anarchism is not of single philosophy but refers to a group of individualistic philosophies that sometimes are in conflict. In 1793, William Godwin, who has often been cited as the first anarchist, wrote Political Justice, which some consider to be the first expression of anarchism. Godwin, a philosophical anarchist, from a rationalist and utilitarian basis, opposed revolutionary action and saw a minimal state as a present, necessarily evil that would become increasingly irrelevant and powerless by the gradual spread of knowledge. Godwin advocated individualism, proposing that all cooperation in labor be eliminated on the premise that this would be most conducive with the general good. An influential form of individualist anarchism, called egoism or egoist anarchism, was expounded by one of the earliest and best-known proponents of individualist anarchism, the German Max Stirner. Stirner's The Ego and Its Own, published in 1844, is a founding text of the philosophy. According to Stirner, the only limitation on the rights of the individual is the power to obtain what they desire, without regard for God, state, or morality. To Stirner, rights were spooks in the mind, and he held that society does not exist but the individuals are its reality. Stirner advocated self-assertion and foresaw unions of egoists, non-systematic associations continually renewed by all parties' support through an act of will, which Stirner proposed as a form of organization in place of the state. Egoist anarchists claim that egoism will foster genuine and spontaneous union between individuals. Egoism has inspired many interpretations of Stirner's philosophy. It was rediscovered and promoted by German philosophical anarchist and LGBT activist John Henry Mackay. Josiah Warren is widely regarded as the first American anarchist, and the 4-page weekly paper he edited during 1833, The Peaceful Revolutionist, was the first anarchist periodical published. For American anarchist historian Eunice Minette Schuster, it is apparent that Proudhonian anarchism was to be found in the United States at least as early as 1848, and that it was not conscious of its affinity to the individualist anarchism of Josiah Warren and Stephen Pearl Andrews. William B. Greene presented this Proudhonian mutualism in its purest and most systematic form. Henry David Thoreau was an important early influence in individualist anarchist thought in the United States and Europe. Thoreau was an American author, poet, naturalist, tax resister, development critic, surveyor, historian, philosopher, and leading transcendentalist. He is best known for his books Walden, A Reflection upon Simple Living in Natural Surroundings, and his essay, Civil Disobedience, an argument for individual resistance to civil government in moral opposition to an unjust state. Later, Benjamin Tucker fused Stirner's egoism with the economics of Warren and Proudhon in his eclectic, influential publication Liberty. For these early influences, individualist anarchism in different countries attracted a small but diverse following of bohemian artists and intellectuals. For love and birth control advocates, individualist naturist nudists, freethought and anti-clerical activists, as well as young anarchist outlaws in what came to be known as legalism and individual reclamation. These authors and activists included Oscar Wilde, Emile Armand, Han Reiner, Henry Zisly, Renzo Novatore, Miguel Jimenez Igualada, Adolf Brand and Lev Cherny, among others. In his important essay The Soul of Man Under Socialism from 1891, Oscar Wilde defended socialism as the way to guarantee individualism, and so he saw that with the abolition of private property, then, we shall have true, beautiful, healthy individualism. Nobody will waste his life in accumulating things, and the symbols for things. One will live. To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist, that is all. For anarchist historian George Woodcock, Wilde's aim in The Soul of Man Under Socialism is to seek the society most favorable to the artist. For Wilde, art is the supreme end, containing within itself enlightenment and regeneration, to which all else in society must be subordinated. Wilde represents the anarchist as aesthete. Woodcock finds that the most ambitious contribution to literary anarchism during the 1890s was undoubtedly Oscar Wilde, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, and finds that it is influenced mainly by the thought of William Godwin.